All right, so we've got now the recording on, and I'm going to go ahead and get started. This will be the third and I hope final lecture in this series we've been working through, but interrupted last week on Trump's revolution. And the jumping off point is, on the one hand, that in the simple metric of success, how much of a president's agenda is enacted and how quickly Donald Trump joins the very small ranks of the most successful presidents, especially in the modern era. I think, frankly, it's FDR and Donald Trump who have had the most remarkable reliance on executive action to get a lot of their agenda accomplished very quickly, and then massive congressional or legislative action as well. And so that in many ways, whether we're talking about the tariffs, which were obviously subject to a very important court decision yesterday, though that's not the end of it, but what they do to global trade, the big beautiful bill, what it does to the tax code, but what it also does to transfers, especially with regards to Medicaid and supplemental nutrition assistance, or, and this is where I'm going to focus for the final segment of this, restructuring government. And so the Trump administration hopes that the federal government will have somewhere between 400,000 and 1 million fewer employees at the end of the first year. They have not had as rapid a success so far. But when we look at, for instance, government funding for medical research, which I'll focus on today, government involvement in a whole number of operations across our society, there is a clear sign that the role of government in our society is changing. And in particular, as I will suggest, Donald Trump is asserting much greater unilateral presidential control over the entire administrative state, right? A organization of governmental services that is the most expensive, the most extensive, and the most powerful of really all of American government, and that, although created by Congress, is situated in the executive branch. Congress, especially in the post-Watergate era, restricted the ability of the president to interfere with independent agencies that were staffed supposedly by nonpartisan experts in the relative field. So we could talk about the Center for Disease Control, we could talk about the Federal Reserve, we could talk about the Environmental Protection Agency, but the basic idea that these were civil service organizations that chose their employees to fulfill basic statutory mandates on the basis of their qualifications and expertise to do so, and not on the basis of the ideology of the president or the appointed head of the agency. And that the result is that many of these agencies have remained staffed with the same professional civil servants as, right, the party of the president and the head of the agency have shifted with the political tides. This is being attacked by Donald Trump, and I think it's a fundamental shift in, let's call it, post New Deal, but especially post Watergate politics. If he succeeds, and it certainly appears that so far he is succeeding, this will be another fundamental revolution in American politics that Donald Trump is responsible for. And then the final revolution that I will also focus on today, because we haven't discussed it as much as I would like in the previous couple sessions on these topics, is not just deportations. And as we'll get into when we look at the data, the deportations under Trump have not really been dramatically higher than they were in Biden's last year in office, and they're actually quite a bit lower than they were during a couple years of the Obama presidency. But
Mhm.
the way in which
Mhm.
immigrations and customs enforcement, on the one hand, is operating, no longer targeting people on the border exclusively for immediate or fast track deportation, but instead moving into the interior of the country, arresting people in their workplaces, in their churches, in their schools, and at courts, deliberately creating categories of persons who were in this country legally, who had documentation and authorization, if you will, de-documenting them in order to recategorize them as undocumented, and then immediately grabbing them and putting them in a holding facility, a detention center that is among the most brutal and awful, I think, constructed in
Yeah.
American history. And
Yeah.
then, right, the idea that this is not just an effort to control immigration, right? It really is an effort to change the identity of the United States, and both internally and externally. I think if you ask people around the world what are the most well known and potent symbols of the United States, it would be two, right? The American flag, the stars and stripes on the one hand, and the Statue of Liberty on the other. And of course, the Statue of Liberty is set up as a beacon to immigrants in the port that handled the bulk of the immigration wave in the 19th century and has as its mantra, right, send us your huddled masses. Under Donald Trump, the image, the message is clear. We don't want you. And if you come here, we will do our best not only not to fully include you and give you a path to citizenship and belonging as we have in the past. I'm going to assume that everyone listening to this is, right, the child, the grandchild, the descendant of immigrants, right? That's the vast majority of people in this country. We are an immigration nation, but under Donald Trump, the effort is to shift the very identity of the country to make it a country, America first, right? That's on the poster here, American workers first, in which there is a not terribly subtle ethno-national message to this. We only want the native born, and by the way, not even only the native born, but the native born who are European, who are what we like to call white, and the result is, I think it's clearly succeeding. Not only that we're having these cruel, extreme measures being taken, parents and children being separated, citizens being racially profiled, masked, ununiformed law enforcement agents patrolling our streets, grabbing people off the streets, throwing them into unmarked vehicles, and hauling them off to deportation centers, sometimes, right, mistaking a citizen for a person without documentation. And right, that this is not just changing the civility of our society, the capacity for us to get along with and trust each other, the ability for people to turn up at work and do jobs that we all rely on. It is also changing the attractiveness of the United States to immigrants who could easily get visas, work permits, green cards, right? And please note, right, if you look at the CEOs of Silicon Valley, if you look at the people who've put America at the forefront of the 21st century information technology revolution, the revolution that's continuing with artificial intelligence, large portions of them, I don't have exact figures on my head, top of my head, but it's obvious, are foreign born, right? They came to the United States because it was the hub of this kind of research, but also because it was a place where it was well known that you could relocate and be fully included and integrated into our society and prosper, right? And under Donald Trump, that understanding of America is rapidly being erased and replaced with an altogether different image. And the result is that the people from India, China, Europe, who might have come to the United States, highly qualified technology or science or STEM people, are going to Europe, going to China, staying where they're from. This is also, right, the success of Donald Trump's first 6 months in office. We don't have to like it to recognize that it is having a major impact in this sense, not only on our policies and politics and domestic structure, but also, like the tariffs, on the degree of integration into the global economy. Donald Trump is trying to isolate the United States from the rest of the world in a moment in which we are highly integrated into the global economy. And I will just repeat what I've already said to you, that I think that these policies are very likely to damage the material interests of his own supporters, of the people who are understandably angry, not only that the United States has become vastly more unequal in the last 50 years, but that we've become more unequal at a moment in which we've also created vast sums of wealth. We are the richest country in human history, and yet 50% of our population has, on average, $400 in savings. 40% of Americans are evicted in their lifetime. That is profoundly unfair, right? And so people are angry about that. But then you add, by the way, we live in a society that advertises itself as a democracy. We have regular elections in which politicians pledge to do something about all of this. And then 2 years, 4 years, 8 years go by. And guess what? We're more unequal. The 1%, the 0.1%, the 0.01% are more obscenely wealthy, right? The top 1% of American society controls more wealth than 50% of humanity has access to, right? And then you add, oh, and by the way, what's the word for somebody who is that wealthy? Well, the best word is probably oligarch, because that kind of wealth can't help but translate into unequal political and social power. And so these people then, right, have the ability, in the case of Donald Trump, 0.01%, contribute, maybe, we're still trying to figure it out, something approaching $1 billion to his presidential campaign. And by the way, he wins a narrow victory, not because of all of that money directly, but because a lot of people who are left out of wealth creation are angry. And because Donald Trump seems to be the best politician in generations at giving voice to that anger, at making people who feel not only left out and disregarded by the political class, but in many respects invisible, unrecognized. Donald Trump says, I see you. I understand you, and I will be your vengeance, right? That is the entire reason Donald Trump is the most impactful politician of our generation and the most impactful president of maybe the last 90 years. And so having said all of that, right, Donald Trump is going to say to his constituents, I've done exactly what you've elected me to do. I've imposed the tariffs. I've made the tax cuts permanent. I'm restructuring government so that the deep state elites no longer have the power to control your decisions with regards to your personal and bodily liberty. And I am getting all those immigrants out of the country. And what we will figure out over the next year or two is, first of all, whether those policies will be as deleterious to the economic and physical health of the United States as I and many others believe they will be. Right? Will be something where we can test our predictions a couple years from now. And to be honest, I sincerely hope that I am wrong. I don't like Donald Trump. I don't like the threat he represents to democracy, to freedom. I don't like his racism. And there's so much more I don't like about him, but I don't hope that his policies fail, because if they fail, frankly, the people who we should all be concerned about, the most vulnerable in our society, the least well off, are going to be most hurt by the failure. And yes, a large portion of them did vote for Donald Trump. Here's the proposition we'll be able to test. Will having a president who owns the woke libs, who manifests vengeance against the elite, be sufficient to continue to generate support for his politics, even when the policies he's adopting are damaging the material interests and the health of the very people who voted for him? I suspect the answer to that question is going to be complicated, that it won't be the case that he will lose all of his support, but it will also not be the case that he will retain all of his support. This seems to be what is showing up in the polling already. And it seems to be what Donald Trump and his right political operation are anticipating. They are anticipating that they will not do well in 2026 in congressional elections, right? Joni Ernst just announced that she, or I should say, didn't just announce, but it's just become public knowledge that she's soon to announce that she won't run for the Senate. That's right, 3 Republican senators not running in 2026. There's some either chance, right, that the Democrats could regain control of the Senate, but I think there's a very good chance that the Democrats will regain control of the House. And here, let me just say a little bit by way of background why I'm making that prediction. It's not just that I think that Donald Trump's policies are going to be highly disruptive and in the short run likely to diminish economic growth, increase inflation, increase inequality, and in so doing to alienate a substantial portion of his base. It is also the case that, frankly, in the last 20 odd years of American politics, we have not had a stable majority party. The pattern of American politics has been basically we vote the incumbents out and we give the other party a chance to do better, right? And maybe that lasts 2 years, 4 years, even 8 years. But at the end of that period, we are not satisfied with whether it's the Republican or the Democrat. And so we turn to the other party. And obviously, I assume most of us are actually stable in our partisan identities. Most Americans are. But the idea that the support for either party never gets to a majority, and that most people who don't just have a dyed in the wool partisan identity are dissatisfied with whoever the incumbent is reflects, I think, something extremely important, which is we are dissatisfied with government across the democratic world in the 21st century because it doesn't seem to answer to our needs. So even if Donald Trump were just an ordinary president, you would expect a correction in 2026 that the Democrats would have at least a modest blue wave election. But Donald Trump is not an ordinary president. He's an incredibly impactful and successful president who is doing things that I think are going to be highly destructive to the economy and have alienated large numbers of Americans. He anticipates that he will lose control of the House of Representatives in 2026 if things take their ordinary course. And so he doesn't want them to take their ordinary course. If the House of Representatives is controlled by the Democrats, well, first of all, he loses initiative as a politician. He has been able to get as much done as he has because the two other branches have been supine, right? The House and the Senate are controlled by Republicans who are either enthusiastic in their support for Donald Trump or sufficiently intimidated by his bullying that they will not stand up to him. And so the Congress has not been a check on Donald Trump, despite the fact that Donald Trump is redistributing power from Congress to the presidency in a way that is adverse to their institutional interests. They just haven't fought that battle at all. They've chosen to roll over. And then we have a majority on the Supreme Court. I'm going to say more about this in coming weeks. I want to focus really on the idea of constitutional democracy and the role of the Supreme Court in a moment like the moment we're in which a president seems to have autocratic ambitions and a majority of the Supreme Court seems to agree with those ambitions. So today, very briefly, here's what I'll say. I think that the majority of the Supreme Court believes that the last, call it 70 years of the constitutional jurisprudence of the Supreme Court was a mistake. That the rights revolution that gave us civil rights, women's rights, gay rights, the right to privacy, that involved a great deal of creativity and innovation on the part of the Supreme Court in detecting in the Constitution principles that had been dormant or not fully developed, that was in fact not constitutional. But they also know that as an institution, they have limited legitimacy, authority, and capacity. That their ability to get things done depends on the other branches of government cooperating and ultimately on the people of the United States supporting what they're doing. And by the way, their view of the last 70 years is a minority view and one that frankly involves something of a cultural revolution in the United States. We've seen they've overturned Roe v. Wade and abortions have continued to go up in the aftermath of that decision. It's a pretty good indication that the American people don't want, or at least a large portion of us don't want them to scale back the rights revolution. I think they see in Donald Trump a cooperating branch of government, and they are extremely hesitant to restrict his capacity to do what he wants to do because a large portion of it overlaps with what they want to do, and they want to maintain his power and his legitimacy. And so in these circumstances, then Donald Trump is unchecked. If the House goes over to the Democrats, well, there will be a check, there will be a balance, there will be investigations, and Donald Trump and his administration will be in the crosshairs of one of the branches of government. It may very well be that illegality, unconstitutionality, and criminality will be revealed by House investigations, that Donald Trump could be impeached for a third time, right? And so all of that to say, Donald Trump is trying to hold on to power by maintaining a partisan majority in Congress. That's not unusual. Every president wants to do that. But having said that, the means that Donald Trump is willing to employ are, again, I think, unprecedented. So I've got an image on the board, right? And it is Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C., a couple blocks down from the White House. And what we have here, right, is the scowling visage of a would-be autocrat. I think if you were to squint and right, do the imaginative exercise of saying to yourself, this is not the United States, maybe this is somewhere in Latin America, maybe this is somewhere in Eastern Europe, maybe this is somewhere in Africa, you would know what you're looking at. You're looking at the slide into autocracy, the imagery of an autocrat decorating government buildings and the military in the street, in the Capitol, in order to support him and carry out his will when or if the people turn against him, right? And we have, if you will, the what would be extreme in other circumstances, but still not as extreme measure of trying to redistrict in the middle of a decade in Texas and Indiana and elsewhere in order to secure naked partisan advantage. And then I think we have the effort to weaponize the power agencies in our government, the military, the Department of Justice, the FBI, and of course, Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, to begin to intimidate, to begin to put the thumb on the scale, right? Please note that Lisa Cook was fired by Donald Trump a couple days ago. She's one of 7 governors on the Federal Reserve's Board of Governors, the most powerful bank in the United States, the central bank. And the reason that she was fired by Donald Trump is because she submitted 2 mortgage applications in close succession. At least this is what we're told. I don't think any of us have seen the evidence, listing 2 different places as her primary resident, right? And please note, it's not like the person who is a Trump appointee and a Trump hack found this as part of a broader investigation of mortgage fraud in the United States. He recognized that Donald Trump doesn't want Lisa Cook to actually serve out her 14-year term. He recognized that he might potentially be able to go into her information and generate some leverage, some ammunition. And so that's what he did, and now Donald Trump is using it. This is the stuff of banana republics, right? And we are seeing the gradual shift from the President of the United States, from his administration, from his political party, from his political appointees, in the direction of using every lever of power, every so-called independent agency for the purpose of maximum partisan warfare everywhere all the time. And if I am right that Donald Trump's policies are going to do economic and other kinds of damage to the people of the United States, and that some of his base is going to turn against him, we should anticipate more of this. I will conclude today, I hope, with a little bit of information about information and customs enforcement. I believe I've shared with you already that the Trump cabinet jokingly refers to them as the secret police. I will now add, as we will see, that in the new big beautiful bill budget for ICE, their funding is going to go up 6 times higher than it is already. To put this in context, ICE in 2026 will have a budget that exceeds all but 2 of the world's militaries. Only the United States and China spend more on their militaries than the United States is about to spend on immigration and customs enforcement. What is ICE going to do with $30 billion? And I'm just going to be direct. I don't see any way that you can spend that much money on immigration and customs enforcement. They are already behaving in ways that suggest they are a domestic police force, and not just a domestic police force, right? Their union is the only union among federal law enforcement agencies that endorsed Donald Trump twice. Other law enforcement agencies thought about, right, endorsing Donald Trump and decided not to after he mobilized a crowd to attack police at the Capitol to overturn the results of an election, right? ICE decided that was okay with them, that they didn't have solidarity with other law enforcement agencies. And the recruiting that is being done for ICE right now, where people are getting $50,000 for, right, bonuses for signing up for ICE, is explicitly, right, white ethno-nationalists. I am deeply worried that this is not the end of the story. This is the beginning chapters of Donald Trump trying to use federal power, executive power, to change the political dynamics of the United States in ways that favor his power if he loses support from his own constituencies. So to review now very quickly, we've talked extensively about tariffs. Please note, of course, right, that the appeals court yesterday upheld 2 different lower courts that had concluded that many of the Trump tariffs are illegal, right, that these are not authorized by the International Economic Emergency Statute, IEPA, under which Donald Trump is claiming authority, that there is no emergency and that the legislation does not authorize tariffs. I'm not up to speed on the details of their decision, but what I do know is they've given Donald Trump until October to appeal. And then, given what I've just said about the Supreme Court, there's, I think, a good likelihood that he wins on appeal. But at least through October, we know that the tariff rate in the United States is going to be roughly 6 times higher than it's been for decades, and that this change occurs not in an incremental way, but on a dime, that it is going to be a shock to our economy. Our best efforts at estimating what it's going to do is that it's going to diminish the disposable income of the relatively poor, the low income, and the middle income by somewhere between 2 and 4% per family. This is a different way of thinking about it, because if tariffs eventually restructure our supply lines or our domestic productivity, that's not going to occur overnight. We have to look at the short run versus the long run impact of the tariffs, right? And the short run might mean 2 to 5 years. The long run, right after the short run is over. Not a uniform time metric because we're looking at a bunch of different categories, but metals, clothing, crops, electrical equipment, all going to go up by 25 to 40% in the immediate aftermath of these tariffs. And so one way to express this is these tariffs are going to be inflationary. One way to notice this is to notice that the tariff revenue has gone way up. It's going to keep going up, right? And despite that, even after a huge surge in imports, imports are not really going down. So these costs are going to be passed on to most Americans. We're already seeing the people who purchase inventory reporting to the Bureau of Labor Statistics that they're experiencing 4 to 5% inflation. Our inflation numbers actually didn't go up last month. That's good news, obviously, but does that mean that we're out of the woods with inflation? This data suggests that we're not. And by the way, right, inflation is higher in 2025 than it was predicted to be. And the evidence that the American economy is not growing as quickly is a little bit more ambiguous. Since this diagram was prepared, there appears to be some recovery of economic activity in the second quarter of 2025, but I don't know that that's going to last. I think it's primarily to do with healthcare expenditures and AI or information economy expenditures, whether it will translate into the economy as a whole, whether we will be able to sustain that growth, or as opposed to that, the Trump policies will have a recessionary impact, as many people expect. That's an open question, right? I'm going to shift now to what I'm going to call the attack on the administrative state and independent agencies by Donald Trump. Some of this is familiar, right? We've looked at Trump's efforts to insult and badger Chairman Jerome Powell of the Federal Reserve into following his will. A little bit of historical background here. I've got Andy Warhol's portrait of Richard Nixon on the board, in part because, right, Nixon is the last president who succeeded in getting the Federal Reserve to lower interest rates based on his political expediency as opposed to their economic judgment. And we know what happened, by the way, 1971, 1972, Richard Nixon gives the economy a sugar high. He gets reelected. By the way, he probably would have been elected anyway. And then we experience profound inflation, one of the worst episodes of inflation in the nation's history. And to be as clear as possible, obviously the OPEC oil shock has something to do with that too. But the Fed Reserve basically, by bending to the will of a president, prevented itself from being able to contain that inflationary shock. If, right, Donald Trump now not only badgers Chairman Powell, but gets Lisa Cook to resign her governorship in the Fed Reserve, one of 7 people on that body, and replaces her with someone who is more to his liking, he will have a majority on the Fed Reserve. And it seems pretty clear that the new members will do what Donald Trump wants them to do, to lower interest rates. And by the way, Donald Trump is talking about radical decreases in interest. Jerome Powell seems to be signaling that maybe he will lower, right, the Federal Reserve benchmark by half a basis point, right, 0.5%. What Donald Trump is talking about is lowering interest rates by 3%. We see with the data on the tariffs, right? He does not like gradual incremental changes. He wants to act boldly, suddenly, and I'm going to say recklessly. And if the Fed Reserve starts acting in that way, right, we may see a major erosion of international confidence in the US Treasury at a moment where we are roughly $30 trillion in debt and going roughly $500 billion further into debt each year, right? And so to be as clear as possible, when the world loses confidence in us, we pay more to borrow money. A few months ago, in the context of talking about the decoupling of the US from the global economy, I mentioned the phrase exorbitant privilege, right? And there's actually a calculus that is done that suggests that the US borrows money from the rest of the world about 1.5 percentage points less than a comparable country would, because our dollar is the de facto global currency. If other countries lose confidence in us, if we lose our exorbitant privilege, if, say, our cost of borrowing goes up 1%, let's say, treasury bonds go up 1%, that's what we have to pay the world in order to enlist them or incentivize them to buy our debt. Well, then two things happen, right? Our debt goes up, right? Because now we're paying more to service our debt, but also credit across the board in the United States goes up. In particular, the cost of consumer and commercial credit, the cost that individuals pay on their credit cards, their mortgages, their student loans, if they're not fixed rate, and the cost that corporations pay to borrow money to create new facilities goes up. There's a word for that, right? It's inflation, right? And so the idea that Donald Trump is willing to turn, right, I guess I should say to trade the short-term political advantage, right? If he gets the Fed Reserve to cut interest rates, maybe there's a sugar high in the economy for the short term. Maybe that's enough to allow the Republicans to retain control of Congress, but maybe it risks another decade of extreme inflation. I think we have to recognize that this is the way Donald Trump intends to govern. He intends to govern with control over formally independent organizations, and to do so on the basis of short-term political expediency, even if it is deleterious to the health of the nation. Who knows? Maybe a later day Andy Warhol will give us a similar image of Donald Trump, but I don't think the rest of us want the second incarnation of Richard Nixon wrecking our economy. Now, here's the problem, right? Lisa Cook is being fired, or at least that's the effort, and the statute in question says she must be fired for cause. And the cause here, right, that's being cited is that she perhaps engaged in fraud on mortgage applications. It's not at all clear. We haven't seen the evidence. A court has to ascertain and decide whether or not that discrepancy between her two applications actually constitutes fraud. But let's assume that's all true. Is that cause to fire her? And generally speaking, when we think about cause to fire in the context of legal action, no, right? It has to be related to the duties that you're performing. There has to be a dereliction of duty or some kind of corruption or incompetence. And right, those mortgage applications were submitted years before she was on the Fed Reserve, right? And so if this were ordinary times, I would suggest that this is not going to succeed. But I have Article 2, Section 1 of the Constitution. As I say, I'm getting ready to think with you more systematically about the problems with our Constitution's capacity to restrain a president who wants to exercise unchecked executive power. And if you want to point to the place in the Constitution that seems to be most problematic, I would suggest Article 2, Section 1, the very first sentence, right? The executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States. And as you may know, all the way back in 1787 to 1789, when this country was debating the adoption of this Constitution, this provision was seen as problematic, right? Because, well, maybe its intent is what some people call titulary, right? It has to do with the term. We're not going to have a king. We're not going to have a prime minister. We're not going to have governance by committee. We're going to have a president, right? And that's who's going to be the executive. Or alternatively, does this sentence say whatever executive power is, all of it belongs to whoever we elect as president? And Donald Trump and the people surrounding him are inclined to read Article 2, Section 1, the first sentence, as this kind of incredibly expansive grant of power. And by the way, so too it appears does the majority of the Supreme Court. And that may mean that any plausible definition of cause is sufficient for Donald Trump to exercise greater authority. And please note, it's not just the Fed Reserve, right? We're focusing on that because it has such a large impact on our economy. But it is also the Bureau of Labor Statistics, where he fired the messenger. It is the Center for Disease Control, where yesterday or the day before he fired the director. It's the Environmental Protection Agency, where his administration has fired the Scientific Advisory Board and is attempting to undo the endangerment finding on climate change and greenhouse gases, right? This is a president who does not respect the independence of independent agencies in the federal government, because he says that's a violation of my executive power. And so we are seeing a fundamental restructuring of American government in a way that I think is going to be deleterious to not only our economy with the Fed Reserve, but also our health. And so I've got a lot of words on the board. This is only half the quotation, but I want to share this with you. And I think this is extraordinarily interesting and important. Sorry, just trying to also keep track of the time. And I say this because this is a letter of recommendation from the top CDC vaccine expert who, right, resigned 2 days ago in the aftermath of the firing of the head of the CDC. By the way, one of the reasons, I'll put the faces on the board here for a second, Susan Manaras was fired is because she refused to fire these three doctors, right? Daniel Jenigan, who was the leader of the agency's work on emerging infectious disease, Dr. Deborah Oury, who's the agency's deputy director, and then the person whose letter I'm going to read, Dr. Daskalakis, who's the top vaccine official at the Fed Reserve. And I'm sorry, at the CDC. And so let's read his letter, and then I'll speak with you a little bit about the assault on another, right, independent agency here, the CDC, and its likely implications in politics. So Dr. Daskalakis says, I am writing to formally resign my position as director of the National Center for Immunization and Respiratory Diseases at the Center for Disease Control and Prevention. I am unable to serve in an environment that treats CDC as a tool to generate policies and materials that do not reflect scientific reality and are designed to hurt rather than to improve the public's health, right? Now, I want to be clear about this just for a moment, right? Three top officials, I think between them they'd served roughly 70 years at the CDC, resign at the same time because they want the public to understand that the agency that protects our health is under assault. And by the way, when they gather their personal affairs and walk personal effects and walk out of the building, the entire staff of the CDC comes out with them to cheer them, right? And this is an effort to call attention to a risk that they think is a deep, genuine risk to our health. That's why I think it's important to pay a little bit of attention to this letter, which I don't think has received much attention. The recent change in the adult and children's immunization schedule threatened the lives of the youngest Americans and pregnant people. The data analyses that supported this decision have never been shared with CDC, despite my respectful request to HHS and other leadership. Remember, this is the doctor who is in charge of immunization for respiratory diseases, asking the Secretary of Health and Human Services, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., to share information with him, and no information is being shared, right? This lack of meaningful engagement was further compounded by a frequently asked questions document written to support the Secretary's directive that was circulated by HHS without input from CDC, subject matter experts, and that cited studies that did not support the conclusions that were attributed to these authors. So now, to be as clear as possible, right? Robert F. Kennedy Jr. was a long history of trading in health disinformation, is using the nation's top health agencies to disseminate health disinformation and citing studies to support his views that do not, in fact, support his views. At least that is what Dr. Deskakoulis alleges, right? So, continuing, having worked in local and national public health for years, I have never experienced such radical non-transparency, nor have I seen such unskilled manipulation of data to achieve a political end rather than the good of the American people. To be as clear as possible, I'm about to get into this in greater detail. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is not a crank or a kook. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is somebody who wants to be the next president of the United States. He's almost certainly running in 2028. He ran in 2024, and he believes that these positions will actually allow him to vault to the head of the Republican Party contest to succeed Donald Trump. That's what we've got to get to the bottom to. So although from the perspective of a CDC doctor and scientist, this stuff does not amount to sound policy and is not based in meaningful research, from the political perspective of Robert F. Kennedy Jr., this is exactly what he should be doing. That's what we need to get our heads around. So now, to continue with Dr. Deskakoulis' letter, it is untenable to serve in an organization that is not afforded the opportunity to discuss decisions of scientific and public health importance released under the moniker of the CDC. So the title that I've given to these two slides, right? Mass exit of expert leadership at CDC. I want to explain a little bit that I'm drawing on an economist, someone who's done really important work in organization theory, A.E.O. Hirschman, who titled one of his most influential books, Voice, Exit, Loyalty. And his claim was that in organizations, employees have three different ways of relating to the organization. They sometimes have internal voice. If they don't like what the organization is doing, they can speak up, criticize, and try to change the course. There's internal deliberation and dialogue. When that is lacking, they only have two choices: exit or loyalty. And I believe what Dr. Diskalakis is saying here is quite clear. Loyalty to this organization no longer makes sense. It would betray the principled reason I went into public health, which is to serve the health of the public, to continue to work with this organization. So I have only one option left: exit. And he's quite clear, right? The Center for Disease Control, the Health and Human Services Agency of the federal government, are doing things that are going to jeopardize the health and lives of Americans. The desire to please a political base will result in death and disability of vulnerable children and adults. I am not sure who the secretary is listening to, but it is quite certainly not us. Unvetted and conflicted outside organizations seem to be the sources HHS uses over the gold standard science of CDC and other reputable sources. Eugenics plays prominently in the rhetoric being generated and is derivative of a legacy that good medicine and science should continue to shun. The nation's health security is at risk and is in the hands of people focusing on ideological self-interest. If they continue the current path, they risk our personal well-being and the security of the United States. Right? So that's, I hope you understand why I wanted to spend a few minutes sharing with you the content of that letter. By the way, it's excerpts from the letter. You can find the full letter as well as the letters of resignation of his colleagues online quite readily, but unfortunately the news media is not paying a lot of attention to them. Let me now shift into the broader context. And I want to try to understand how in the third decade of the 21st century, we have become so polarized around science and expertise that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. thinks that the best way to vault to the front of the pack to succeed Donald Trump is to do things that risk a future pandemic, right? That risk a bad COVID season, a bad flu season, but even worse, the rapid spread of avian flu. Please note, right, that $1.5 billion have been cut from NIH research. I've got a little bit of data coming up on this, right, in terms of the cuts to services. I'm sorry, this is right, the total cuts over a decade, 3.2 billion from NIH. That includes not only the mRNA vaccine research, but also research on cancer and Alzheimer's, right? Who's opposed to curing cancer and Alzheimer's? Well, I don't want to quite put it that way, but I think we need to get our head around the fact, right, that a large portion of Republicans trust Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and Donald Trump basically as much as they trust their own doctors, and a lot more than they trust the CDC, the FDA, or pharmaceutical companies, right? We are in a climate where we have polarized around trust of medical and scientific expertise and the way in which it's used by the government. And so one aspect of this has to do with the fact that the portion of America who now increasingly distrusts medical science does not believe that expertise is fairly distributed. They don't believe that they ever could have gained the credentials to become experts themselves. They believe that only the affluent get to go to those schools and get those degrees. And so maybe the affluent are using their access to knowledge and expertise to further their interests. Please note, right, that pharmaceutical companies and medical insurance companies are some of the most profitable and least popular companies in the United States today. And so when they look at the FDC, when they look at the FDA, when they look at the CDC cooperating, right, so closely, I shouldn't have said FDC, FDA, CDC, sorry, cooperating so closely with the pharmaceutical companies, they kind of wonder, is this just a scam? Is this just hiding behind expertise to control our liberty and to gain greater profit? That dynamic has been going on for quite a while. But then I think we have to recognize that COVID rapidly accelerated and, in a sense, really polarized us around these issues, especially the health dimension of these issues. And so I just want to build on some stuff that David Wallace Wells has been writing in the New York Times and elsewhere about the way in which we are so eager to forget the trauma of COVID. And I want to add, there's some interesting research which I'll be sharing with you in a later class on Gen Z, the youngest people in our society, and the growing support for Donald Trump, in particular among people who came of age in the COVID or post-COVID era. And so Gen Z includes a number of people who came of age before COVID hit, and they're actually inclined to vote Democratic, to trust medical science, to be in favor of Black Lives Matter, which was one of the signature movements of their coming of age period, and to be opposed to Donald Trump in particular. But the people who are younger are much more inclined to be supportive of Donald Trump, to mistrust medical information. And I want to focus on two things. The first is that when they lost 2 years to COVID, they lost, 10% of their life, right? The perspective of somebody who's 60, 70, 80 on having been socially isolated for 2 years is very different from the perspective of somebody who's 16, 17, 18 at the time. And it's not just that that's a smaller portion of our lives. It's also that the things that we were doing in our 60s, 70s, 80s are much less formative and significant than the people who missed their high school graduations, their junior prom, being able to see their friends, being able to play on the football team or be on the cheer squad in their senior year in high school, right? And so there's a lot of anger. There's also a lot of trauma. We lost 1.5 million people to COVID in our society. 30 million people were hospitalized, right? And many of us spent the better part of a year in great fear that an invisible virus that would be transmitted maybe by someone we love or in a context where we have to be for healthcare or work would infect us and kill us, right? And that is a traumatic experience to not be able to protect your own physical safety. And very often, people who've experienced trauma try to keep it at arm's length. And so rather than learning the lessons of COVID, we're playing a blame game about COVID. whose fault was it? Was it Anthony Fauci's fault that we did all this stuff that it turns out we didn't need to do, that we restricted the liberty of our fellow citizens? And what is Fauci? Well, he's a public health expert. Maybe we should mistrust and dislike not only him, but everybody like him who abused their authority to restrict our liberty, who forced us to wear masks and stop going to work and stop going to social engagements that were meaningful to us. And as it turns out, maybe they were wrong in some of these accounts. So the idea that trust in vaccines has become a partisan and polarized issue that is driving a realignment. Please note that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. was a Democrat for his entire life until COVID created this opening to align anti vaccine ideas with the Republican Party. Please note that Donald Trump, right, probably his signature accomplishment as president so far has been the rapid development of the COVID vaccine, and he has appointed an anti-vaxxer to be in charge of American public health, right? And so I want to finally tie this to a deeper issue, right? And to make it clear, there is, I think, something to be said for the principled reason to want to be in control of your body, to not want to have the government tell you that you have to insert some foreign substance into your body. We call it bodily autonomy, right? And in many cases, we like that idea. But I think many liberals think that when it's an issue of collective safety, of protecting each other, we are willing to sacrifice bodily autonomy, especially when it doesn't seem to us to be that significant, right? It's getting a vaccine. We all do that already anyway. But please note, right? The vaccine was a new kind of vaccine, a genetically engineered vaccine, an mRNA vaccine, right? And there is widespread belief among Republicans. And again, I think to understand this, you really have to go online. You have to go into the podcast social influencer world of social media and understand that the most influential person in that world, Joe Rogan, right, almost had his show canceled over his vaccine denial, and to begin to recognize the sense that this was a matter of being willing to be open to accepting a risk to stand up for your freedom. That there was a sense among many people that this was the manly thing to do. And so then that takes us to, right, the deep cuts to medical research. This is not just about vaccinations or the development of future vaccinations. This is about the budgets for the places in the United States that are engaged in cutting edge medical research, public health research. I'm going to stop. I know I'm out of time, but I want you to look at one more thing very quickly here. And that is, as I said at the very beginning, the ICE budget. And so let me get there. There it is. And so at the same time that the FBI budget, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, right, the Department of Justice are seeing their budgets cut. We're seeing, right, the Department of, well, I should say Department, the right, Immigration Customs Enforcement Services having their budget, right, multiplied 6 times over what it has been on average for the last decade. And I don't see that we can build enough detention centers. We can hire enough enforcement agents. We could create, right, a fleet of planes to deport people to foreign countries. This would be wasteful spending. We don't need it, right? But frankly, even if we were super aggressive about deporting everybody who can be deported, we're not going to be able to do that. And we don't need $30 billion to do it. I think we should recognize that this is the beginning of the building of an unaccountable domestic police force within the US federal government, given the way Donald Trump is claiming unilateral and complete executive control over all forces within the executive branch. He needs police services that are willing to comply, that don't have their own independent culture. The FBI has stood up and pushed back against him. The military, right, when he wanted to invoke the Insurrection Act around the George Floyd protests in 2020, refused, right, to be involved in domestic policing and politics. The Department of Justice obviously considers itself to be bound by law, precedent, and norm. ICE, frankly, is the most likely agency to do the president's dirty work. If that's what he directs it to do, if that's what he wants it to do in 2026, and if, by the way, we've had, I'm sorry, uh, massive public health problems, another pandemic, if we're in the grips of a recession or stagnation, the idea that Donald Trump has used emergency powers already 10 times in his first 6 months in office, that he's not shy about invoking or manufacturing emergencies to justify uses of expansive power, I think we should anticipate and be prepared and be ready and organized to resist this kind of politics should it materialize in 2025, but especially 2026 around our forthcoming elections. Thank you for letting me complete that. I know it went on for a while. Let me stop there, hear your thoughts, hear your questions. Who wants to start us out today? Flossie, go ahead, but you need to unmute yourself. I don't think I can unmute you. You're still muted, Flossie. You need to maybe hold your space bar down, or if you can, click that little red microphone icon. Is anybody close by, Flossie, to help her? No. I'm sorry, Flossie. We're still not able to hear you. So Flossie, I don't know how much more I can help. I'm gonna ask if anybody else has a question. If you get yourself unmuted, let us hear from you, please. Anybody else? Yeah,
Yeah.
Sandy, go ahead.
Yeah. I don't understand. There must be an army of people that are orchestrating this because I somehow can't believe that someone as dumb as he appears to be, Donald Trump, can be 10 steps ahead all the time in every single area. So who are these army of people?
Well, so I don't know how dumb or how demented Donald Trump is.
Yeah.
I mean, and so he has been elected president of the United States twice. He does seem to have a genius for branding, right? And that doesn't mean that everything. Obviously, I may totally lack that capacity, and I don't necessarily like that capacity, but he has that capacity. And by the way, sometimes that's what allows someone to succeed in politics. And then, in addition to that, he has a tremendous instinct for his base. And note, right, that this is what happens in American politics and politics throughout the world, right? That Donald Trump in earlier eras in American politics and history was a laughing stock, right? Most people did think he was a buffoon. And then in a sense, the national mood began to align with his personal brand better. And so I'm not sure if you call that genius or luck, but there's some of that in this as well. But then I'm going to add, it shouldn't be a mystery. Project 2025,
Mm.
the Heritage
That's
Foundation,
good.
right,
Yeah.
which received hundreds of millions of dollars in order to be able to employ a whole bunch of lawyers and former officials to work out these projects. And I don't think, for instance, his Treasury Secretary or his trade advisors are barking up the right tree. I think they've got crazy ideas, but they do have PhDs from Harvard, et cetera, right? And so yeah, there are enough people surrounding him, enough people profiting from his policies who are very, very wealthy, right in the top 0.01%, for him to be able to surround himself and get the wherewithal to implement all of this. So yeah, I don't think it should be that much of a mystery. It's a combination of Donald Trump's instinct and a whole bunch of people who see themselves well represented or enriched by him collaborating with him. Yeah. Thank you for the question, Sandy.
It's so depressing. This is all so very depressing.
Well, but we have to be careful not to be depressed. We have to be angry and
Yeah,
energized because
and
the
resist.
battle is on, right?
Yeah.
Barbara, go ahead. I
What
like
if
the Statue of Liberty in the background, by the way.
Yeah, Lady Liberty. What if his health fails? Seriously, not
Yeah,
his mental health, because that's going to be really hard to prove. Because
yeah.
he's a consummate actor, and all we have to do is think back to Reagan to realize as you lose your mental acuity, you do remember how to do the things that you're good at.
Yeah, so Reagan was very good with the teleprompter. Donald Trump is notoriously not very good, right, with scripted speech. And I'll just add, right, that one of Trump's fixations is Joe Biden's mental decline, right? And very often Donald Trump reveals what he's really worried about by what he accuses other people of. But having said all of that, let's assume, yeah, your scenario, right, which is that his physical health fails. Let's say he dies in office with a year or two left. Well, we know what happens, right? J.D. Vance becomes the president of the United States. I think, in a sense, then the question is J.D. Vance able to command the loyalty of Trump's base to something like the same degree that Donald Trump has? And I will note, right, that there's an aura to the person who sits at the resolute desk and stands behind the presidential podium, right? And so he will benefit from the gravity and symbolism of being president of the United States. But I will also note that J.D. Vance, when he ran for the Senate in Ohio, did considerably worse than most other right Republican politicians running for office in the state at the same time, and much worse than Donald Trump in the state, right? Which seems to indicate that his previous efforts at transforming himself into a MAGA politician were not fully successful, right? And he's on record as having referred to Donald Trump as potentially the American Hitler, right? And other things like that. So I don't know if either J.D. Vance has the instincts, the charisma, the je ne sais quoi, right? That allows somebody to connect with the American people through the media system to really take over for Trump and be as successful as Trump has been. And then I would just add, by the way, what I'm predicting to you is that Donald Trump's successes in getting his agenda passed are going to undermine his popularity, his standing. They're going to damage the American people, which will lead at least a portion of us who haven't already turned against him to turn against him. His approval rating is quite low. Some new polling seems to suggest that it's moving further down. Maybe the best thing for Donald Trump's place in the history books would be to die in office after 2 years and leave J.D. Vance to clean up the mess or take the blame, right? So I'm being very speculative, Barbara. I don't really have more than that to say, but it's an interesting scenario to think through. Flossie, are you able to unmute yourself? I'm going to plug in my computer. No, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Let me see. Anybody else with a question or a thought for today?
Yes.
Who is that? Oh, hi, Bill. Go ahead.
What do you think are the chances that if Trump feels that he's going to lose control of at least one house, he will declare a national emergency and cancel the elections? Or if the elections are actually held and he does lose a house or two, that he'll say massive corruption and declare martial law, etc.
Yeah, so I think the second is much more likely. So the concept that I think a lot of people are attracted to these days is competitive authoritarianism, right? That in Russia, in China, in Hungary, there are regular elections. And by the way, the opposition party continues to have candidates in those elections, but that the opposition party has been so weakened by persecution. Their fundraising is so diminished. The media is so biased against them. The institutions of the state are used to try to suppress the turnout of opposition voters. The people get the message that if you turn out and vote for this guy, you may very well have the FBI or ICE turning up at your door to question you about it, that you tilt the playing field. So I suspect that what Trump will be attracted to is the same kind of stuff that the other competitive authoritarians are attracted to, not literally not having the election, but attempting to influence the outcome of the election by using state power to disable effective opposition. Now, having said that, if, right, the results are clear that the Democrats won, then I don't know how Donald Trump reacts and how the people around him react. I share your concern that he may not be inclined to accept that outcome. Give me a second. I've got a different power cord that isn't long enough to allow me to stay in place, so I'm going to move places. Hannah, I see you've got your hand up. Please go ahead.
Mine is a little bit off track of what we're talking about right now, but I have concerns about the government buying an interest in Intel.
Yeah.
And I have really read nothing that supports my concern about this. And I'm wondering if you have anything to say with regard to that.
Yeah, I need to do some more research on that. I'll be honest with you, I haven't given it a lot of thought. As you know, I was kind of on vacation for the last 10 days, and I was in Oregon and Colorado and California when this was unfolding. But I will say it's standard autocrats playbook, right? Which is to say, give more economic power to the president of the United States or whoever it is, Vladimir Putin, allow them to enrich themselves, but also allow them to have some control over the economy. We are accustomed, for instance, in times of war, to the Department of Defense exercising greater control over military provisions, right? That makes sense. But part of what's happening here is that the independent agencies are losing their independence, right? So you would maybe even question that under the Trump administration. But what I understand with Intel is it's just different, right? The president gets much greater control, not an independent agency. And so, yeah, I am concerned about this, but not sufficiently informed about it to really say more than that. But it's something we can come back to once I've done some more reading. Okay, Hannah?
Thank you.
Thank you. Flossie, did we get you unmuted? No. Okay. Sorry. I wish we could hear what you have to say. But next time, let's make sure we've got you set up so that you're able to share your ideas and wisdom with us. And anybody else for today? Well, we went a full half an hour over. Good to be with you on Zoom. Better to have been with you in person last week, but nice to be able to sustain the conversation. These are dark conversations. I wish I could be the bearer of better news. I would remind you that a year ago we were still talking somewhat hopefully about Biden's legacy and Harris's prospects. It's not, even though it feels like this has been going on forever, our permanent place. And I just think, right, we get not only consolation, but some sense of common purpose by talking it through with each other, even when the news is dark. We will continue doing that. Starting next week, I think we'll be talking more about the Constitution. That's where I intend to go. Be well, everyone. See you next Saturday. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Pleasure as always. Thank you. Bye,
Thank you,
guys.
David.
Bye-bye.